not $600, not a dealer service plan, not a remanufactured unit sitting in a cardboard box behind the parts counter with a 90-day warranty that expires before your next oil change. $3. That is the complete cost of the thing that triples the life of your alternator, documented across generations of Toyota, Honda, and Mazda vehicles running in conditions that would destroy a Western fleet in half the mileage. Not maybe. Not under controlled laboratory conditions. Not if you happen to also replace your belt tensioner and clean your battery terminals and say the right prayers on the right morning. $3. Applied correctly, at the right interval, to the right surface, the way Japanese taxi fleet mechanics have been doing it since the early 1960s, while American drivers have been handing $650 across a service counter for a problem that never had to exist in the first place. 99% of car owners watching this right now will never know this exists because the answer sits inside a $40 billion annual repair industry, and that industry does not survive in its current form if you find out. The dealership needs you ignorant, the parts supplier needs you dependent, and every service manual printed in the Western world for the last 4 decades has been written to keep you exactly where you are, sitting in a waiting room under fluorescent lights, drinking bad coffee, staring at an estimate that arrived across the counter like a quiet tax on everything you were never told. To understand why this compound was buried, why it was deleted from every Western service checklist, and why the knowledge survived only in handwritten fleet maintenance logs and the grease-stained notebooks of Osaka garage mechanics, you have to go back to Japan in the years just after the war, when an entire industrial culture was being rebuilt from the ground up, and the people doing the rebuilding could not afford to replace what they could instead preserve. In the early 1960s, Japan's urban taxi culture was expanding at a pace the Western world was not watching closely enough. Toyota and Nissan were producing vehicles by the thousands for metropolitan fleet operators in Osaka, Tokyo, and Nagoya, and those operators were running their cars hard. 12-hour daily cycles, cold starts before dawn, constant electrical load from headlights and radios, and fare meters running without interruption through the full grinding weight of urban use. The economics were brutal and unforgiving. A failed alternator meant a cab pulled off the road, a driver without income, and a repair bill that could break a small operator's entire month. So the mechanics who kept these fleets alive became obsessive about extending component life in ways the official factory manuals never anticipated and, more importantly, never incentivized. What those mechanics discovered and what fleet maintenance logs from that era document in plain functional language was that the alternator's single most vulnerable point was not the diode bridge, not the voltage regulator, not the bearing pressed into the rear housing. It was the slip ring, that small copper surface spinning continuously at engine speed in constant sliding contact with the carbon brushes that draw current from the rotating field coil was oxidizing. A thin layer of copper oxide was establishing itself between the brush face and the slip ring surface, increasing contact resistance, generating micro-arcing invisible to the naked eye, but catastrophic in accumulation, converting electrical energy into heat instead of current, eating the carbon brush from its working face inward, accelerating wear at a rate the factory never planned to solve because the factory, with considerable financial logic, did not need to. Replacement revenue was not a problem anyone in the supply chain wanted to eliminate, but a mechanic in an Osaka garage sometime in the early part of that decade began applying a carbon-based contact preservative compound to the slip ring surface as part of a routine brush inspection that he had added by hand to his own maintenance schedule. Not in the official manual, not in any factory bulletin, written in his own notation in a log that his apprentices would copy into their own notebooks over the following years. The compound was a graphite-bearing grease available from industrial suppliers for almost nothing, the kind of product used in electrical switchgear and relay maintenance across heavy industry, never marketed to automotive consumers, never mentioned in a car manual, sitting on hardware store shelves with no fanfare and no story attached to it. Applied to the slip ring surface, it formed a micro-thin boundary film between the brush face and the copper. It prevented the oxide layer from forming. It kept contact resistance low. It reduced operating temperature at the contact point measurably, and the alternators in that fleet began outlasting comparable units in Western fleets by a factor of 3, then 4, with the oldest documented taxi units running tens of thousands of kilometers beyond anything the factory specification predicted. Original alternators, never rebuilt, still producing rated voltage on vehicles that had become legends inside their own garages, pointed to by younger mechanics as proof that the machine rewarded care in ways the manual did not describe. The solution was born in a taxi garage, and it stayed there. Not because anyone classified it, not because a corporate legal team issued a suppression order. The trick was buried by something far more effective than conspiracy, and far harder to fight than a memo. It was buried by omission. Western service manual writers, working from factory specifications drafted by engineers whose revenue model depended on predictable replacement cycles, simply never included the brush inspection and contact maintenance step that Japanese fleet mechanics had been performing by hand for years. The knowledge was never hidden, it was just never translated. That is the origin irony at the center of this entire story, and it is the thing the industry is most counting on you never to notice. By the 1970s and into the early 1980s, the contact preservation principle had migrated from the Osaka taxi garage into the pit lanes of Japanese endurance racing. Honda and Mazda racing engineers running long-distance events understood charging system reliability in a way civilian mechanics were never taught to think about. A charging system failure at hour 18 of a 24-hour endurance race is a DNF, a wasted season, and a sponsor conversation that ends careers. Racing team technical documentation from that era shows contact maintenance built into charging system service protocols at intervals and with specifications that civilian drivers never saw because civilian drivers were reading manuals that had already quietly removed the step. The same compound, the same application method, under $3 at any industrial supplier. The engineers in the pits knew exactly what they were doing and why. The drivers in the dealership waiting rooms had no idea the step existed. Meanwhile, in the United States, the automotive aftermarket was constructing the architecture that would make this ignorance permanent and profitable. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, alternators became reclassified in Western service culture as sealed, non-serviceable assemblies. The industry framed this in technical language involving contamination risk and tolerance sensitivity, but the practical consequence was straightforward and financially elegant. Brush inspection disappeared from service intervals entirely. A side-by-side comparison of domestic manufacturer service manuals from the mid-1980s against editions published in the early 1990s shows the brush inspection notation present in one and absent in the other, removed without explanation, replaced by nothing, as if the component had simply stopped having a maintenance requirement. In the same period, the alternator remanufacturing market expanded into a multi-billion-dollar segment of what is now a $40 billion annual charging system repair industry. The removal of one maintenance step and the growth of that market are not a coincidence. They are cause and effect written in invoice totals across 30 years of service department receipts. The dealership service bay became the physical face of that architecture. The flat rate labor system turned the alternator replacement into one of the most reliable revenue events in the shop. High parts markup, predictable labor time, a customer who cannot drive home and has already accepted that something expensive is about to happen. A former service director at a major Honda dealership described the dynamic without hesitation. The customer never questions the alternator diagnosis because the car simply will not start, and the moment you cannot start your car, you have already lost the negotiation. The estimate arrives across the counter like a toll. You pay it, you leave, and somewhere in the building, a margin percentage that would embarrass a grocery store gets posted to a ledger that has been growing since the brush inspection step was quietly deleted from the manual. Every time your alternator fails before its time, and it is failing before its time because of a copper oxide layer that $3 of compound would have prevented, someone collected between $500 and $600 they did not earn. The science is not disputed. Tribology research on carbon brush contact resistance has been published in electrical engineering literature for decades. Copper oxidation at the slip ring is a documented electrochemical process with a known progression and a known intervention. The graphite compound interrupts that progression at the first stage, forming a boundary film that keeps the oxide layer from establishing itself between the brush face and the copper surface, holding contact resistance low, holding operating temperature down, and extending brush service life by a factor that fleet data from Japan consistently places at 2 to 3 times the factory prediction. This is not folklore. It is documented in engineering literature, in industrial maintenance manuals for electrical switchgear and heavy machinery, and in the quietly passed down practice of mechanics who learned it from mechanics who learned it in garages that the Western service industry has spent 40 years pretending do not exist. Independent mechanics who applied the technique systematically to Toyota Corolla and Honda Civic taxi fleets documented comparative results that align precisely with the original 1960s findings. warnings. Fleets maintained with the compound at consistent intervals showed alternator lifespan numbers that left control vehicles behind by margins the factory specification would not predict and the dealership service department would not advertise. The oldest vehicles in these documented fleets were carrying original alternators past mileages that Western drivers are conditioned to treat as the natural end of a machine's useful life. That data exists. It was recorded. It was never cited in a Western trade publication, never referenced in a service training curriculum, never attached to a parts catalog or a service bulletin or anything that would have carried it across the ocean and into a garage where an American mechanic might have read it and understood what it meant. It sat in Japanese, in a log, in a garage, and the premium alternator market arrived to fill the space that knowledge should have occupied. Walk into any Western auto parts retailer, and you will find a row of heavy-duty, high-output alternator replacements priced between $180 and $350, each one packaged with the implication that it represents an upgrade over the unit it replaces, a more durable solution, a longer-lasting answer to the problem you keep having. It uses the same brush and slip ring contact design as the $80 unit on the shelf beside it. Without contact maintenance, it will oxidize, it will arc, it will wear, it will fail at roughly the same interval for exactly the same reason, and you will be back at that counter. The $3 compound makes a standard alternator outlast the $350 premium replacement. They sold you an upgrade. They should have sold you a tube. Now here is the method the service manual deleted. You need a graphite bearing electrical contact grease, the kind sold for contact preservation in electrical maintenance applications, available at hardware stores and electrical suppliers for under $3. You need isopropyl alcohol and a lint-free cloth. You need access to the alternator's slip ring surface, which on most Toyota, Honda, and Mazda platforms means removing the rear brush assembly cover, a process that requires a standard screwdriver and takes under 10 minutes on the vast majority of Japanese vehicles built in the last 3 decades. Clean the slip ring surface thoroughly with isopropyl alcohol on the lint-free cloth, removing any oxidation residue or carbon dust left by the brushes. Let it dry completely. 30 seconds, no shortcuts. Apply the compound in an amount approximately the size of a grain of rice to each slip ring contact surface. Use a fingertip or a clean wooden stick. Do not use metal tools against the slip ring surface. The finished surface should appear uniformly matte gray, not shiny copper. Reinstall the brush assembly or rear housing cover. Repeat this process every 40,000 to 60,000 kilometers. That is the complete method. 6 steps. Under 10 minutes. The thing that was written by hand in an Osaka maintenance log in 1962 and removed from every Western service checklist before most of the people reading this were born. And here is the moment that reframes everything. You realize reading those 6 steps that you have probably walked past that tube of compound in a hardware store dozens of times without knowing what it was for. It has been sitting on those shelves for 40 years. The industry did not hide the product. The product was never the secret. They just never told you where to put it. The secret was not a secret. It was a silence, maintained deliberately at a cost of $1,500 per vehicle over a lifetime of replacements that did not need to happen. The financial arithmetic closes itself cleanly. The average Western driver replaces their alternator more than once over the usable life of a vehicle. At $650 to $800 per event, the lifetime cost of not knowing this runs well past $1,000 per car, often higher. The compound costs $3. Applied 4 or 5 times across the same vehicle lifetime, the total investment stays under $20. The difference between those two numbers, multiplied across every vehicle on every Western road, is the $40 billion annual industry that was built on the gap between what you were told and what Japanese fleet mechanics wrote in their notebooks 60 years ago. 60 years of evidence, from the handwritten maintenance addendum in an Osaka taxi garage, through the endurance racing pit documentation of Honda and Mazda engineers, through the independent fleet comparison data recorded by Japanese mechanics in the 2000s, through the service manual editions where the brush inspection step appeared, and then, edition by edition, did not appear. The industry had 60 years to add one line: inspect slip ring surface, apply contact preservative compound. They chose not to. Every financial motive behind that choice is now visible to you. You are holding all of it. The compound compound, the method, the interval, the proof that runs from 1962 to the present day without interruption, the $40 billion that explains every silence in between. Your alternator will outlast your engine if you do this one thing. The $40 billion industry spent 60 years making sure you never knew what that thing was. $3, that is all they were hiding.